The story you are about to hear is not one that history books dare to tell. It is not carved on monuments, nor celebrated in gilded palaces.
They birth
Instead,
offerings.
it lingers in whispers, in shadows, and in the forgotten pages of chronicles written by trembling hands. A tale so grotesque, so forbidden, that even centuries later it feels too dangerous to speak aloud. Yet tonight, we will speak it. Imagine a royal dynasty draped in velvet, their crowns glittering under candlelight, their banquets overflowing with jewels and gold. To the outside world, they were the embodiment of divine power, untouchable, immortal, chosen by the heavens themselves to rule. But behind the heavy curtains of their chambers lay a darkness that no gold could conceal. For this was a bloodline cursed not merely with misfortune, but with an appetite so unholy, so inhuman, that it was said they devoured the very heirs born to carry their legacy forward. Picture the contradiction: a mother rocking her newborn child, not in love, but in dread. A father gazing at his son, not with pride, but with hunger. Lullabies turned into laments, cradles into coffins, and a kingdom forced to bow before rulers whose family tree was watered with blood. For generations, rumors spread like smoke through royal courts across Europe and beyond. Servants spoke in hushed tones about midnight feasts, where meat was served fresh and warm, and no one dared to ask its origin. Diplomats carried whispers back to their homelands, carefully wrapped in letters marked private for fear of scandal. And priests prayed fervently, not for the kingdom's prosperity, but for its deliverance from what they believed was a curse sent by God himself. But was this truly a curse? Or was it something far more human, far more terrifying? History often dresses its villains in robes of madness. But what if there was method to their horror? What if these acts were deliberate? Rituals performed in the shadows, sacrifices masked as indulgence, a desperate attempt to preserve their power through the most taboo means imaginable. To consume blood, to consume flesh, to consume one's own kin. Was it madness or a grotesque form of survival? The deeper we dig, the darker the soil becomes. Chroniclers who dared to document the dynasty's secrets mysteriously vanished, their manuscripts torn apart, their ink-stained hands never seen again. Whole generations of children disappeared from the record books, their names struck from memory as if they had never existed. And yet, fragments of truth survive, hidden in folklore, preserved in secret letters, and etched into the nightmares of those who served behind the palace walls. This is not just the story of a cursed family. It is the story of how power, unchecked and absolute, can rot from the inside out. It is a story of how fear binds entire kingdoms in silence, allowing horrors to thrive in the shadows. And it is a story that forces us to confront the unthinkable, that those who sat upon thrones, draped in jewels and divine authority, may have been monsters of flesh and blood. As you listen, I want you to remember one thing. This tale was never meant to be heard by ordinary people. It was meant to stay hidden, locked away with the bones of forgotten heirs and the ashes of burned manuscripts. But history has a way of whispering its secrets when the world is ready to listen. Tonight, you and I will follow those whispers. We will walk the candlelit halls where laughter turned to screams. We will stand in the royal chambers where the line between parent and predator dissolved. And we will confront the curse that consumed an entire dynasty from within. So settle in. Let the shadows surround you. For the story of the royal bloodline cursed to devour its own children begins not with a coronation, nor with a battle, but with a hunger. A hunger that would leave its mark on history, and on the nightmares of all who dared to remember. Every curse has a beginning. Every shadow has a source. To understand the horror that would one day define this dynasty, we must travel back to the moment of its birth, the rise of a family that seemed destined for greatness, yet carried within it the seed of its own destruction. The dynasty began in an age when kingdoms were fragile, and power was decided not only by swords, but by blood. Dynastic marriages were more than unions of love. They were treaties signed in flesh, contracts sealed with children. From these marriages, this family emerged, uniting powerful lands under a single crown. To the world, their ascent seemed blessed by fortune. Their banners stretched across fields of victory, their coffers overflowed with gold, and their name carried the weight of divine favor. Yet even in their earliest years, strange whispers clung to them like smoke. Chroniclers wrote of omens that appeared at their coronations, blood-red moons, storms that refused to pass, and children born with unsettling features. To neighboring courts, these signs were not dismissed as coincidence. They were interpreted as warnings that this family carried something unholy in their veins. Still, power has a way of silencing doubt. The dynasty's first rulers cloaked themselves in ceremony, parading their divine legitimacy before their subjects. Cathedrals were built in their honor, coins stamped with their likeness, and bards sang of their victories. But inside palace walls, shadows lengthened. Servants whispered of a peculiar coldness in the royal nurseries, where children cried endlessly, and nurses vanished without explanation. It was here, in these early generations, that the foundation of the curse was laid. Stories speak of an ancestor who sought forbidden power, perhaps a pact made in desperation, perhaps a crime so vile it stained his bloodline forever. One tale describes a king who, on the eve of battle, made a sacrifice not of an enemy, but of his own blood, slaughtering a child to secure victory. Another whispers of a queen who dabbled in alchemy and sorcery, consuming blood as medicine, believing it would grant eternal youth. Whether myth or truth, such stories clung to the dynasty like ivy on stone, impossible to rip away. The dynasty's rivals seized upon these whispers. In letters sent between monarchs, one can still find traces of contempt. Words like tainted, unnatural, cursed. But openly, no one dared to challenge them. For their power was real, their armies vast, their alliances ironclad. To accuse them publicly of such sins was to invite war. And so, the rumors survived only in hushed tones, spoken by those who feared what might happen if the dynasty ever heard them repeated. But the shadows were not just stories. They manifested in blood. Records show that the family's children often died young, far more frequently than in other noble houses. Entire branches of the family tree seemed to wither overnight. A prince, barely old enough to walk, suddenly vanishing from chronicles. A princess, her name struck from church records as though she never drew breath. To outsiders, it was a mystery. To insiders, it was something far more sinister. The people of the kingdom, though loyal, were not blind. Folklore began to take shape in their villages and towns. Mothers warned their children not to wander near the palace at night. Fishermen swore they saw processions of black-robed figures moving by torchlight toward hidden chambers beneath the castle. Farmers spoke of hearing faint cries carried by the wind from the royal grounds. Slowly, the dynasty became not just rulers, but figures of dread, revered in daylight, feared after dark. And yet, despite this aura of unease, the dynasty thrived. Each ruler seemed more untouchable than the last. Their enemies fell. Their coffers swelled. Their people, bound by loyalty and fear, bowed ever deeper. This paradox, prosperity shrouded in shadows, is what made them so fascinating and so terrifying. For how could such horrors exist alongside such triumph? How could the same family build cathedrals to God and yet be accused of crimes that defied humanity? The answer lies in secrecy. The dynasty understood something vital. Power was not just about armies or gold, but about controlling what was seen and what was hidden. They mastered the art of silence, erasing their scandals with the same precision they wielded on the battlefield. Chroniclers who questioned them were exiled. Priests who dared to whisper of curses were silenced. Whole libraries were purged of incriminating passages. And so, the truth became a phantom, present, but impossible to grasp. Still, the curse lingered. Even in the brilliance of their reign, a shadow followed them, whispered from generation to generation. Every coronation was haunted by the question, how long until the curse takes its toll again? Every royal birth was clouded by dread. Would this child live, or would they vanish into silence like so many before? In this way, the dynasty's power and its darkness grew together, inseparable. Their rise was not just a triumph of politics or warfare, it was the rise of a legend. A legend that promised glory, but always hinted at horror. A legend that set the stage for what was to come. For though the dynasty seemed invincible, though their banners flew high and their palaces gleamed with riches, a hunger was growing within them. A hunger that would soon reveal itself, not in whispers, but in screams. And when it did, the world would finally see the truth, that this was not merely a royal family. This was a bloodline cursed from its very beginning, born in shadows, and destined to devour itself from within. Every dynasty carries legends, but this family's story was written not in ink, but in blood. To their subjects, they were chosen by heaven. To their enemies, they were demons cloaked in crowns. And to those who lived closest to them, the servants, the priests, the scribes, they were something far worse, a family cursed from the very beginning. The curse, it was said, was not a punishment for weakness, but for sin. Generations before their golden age, when the dynasty was still clawing its way to power, one fateful act set their fate in motion. Some chronicles whisper of a battle so desperate that the ruling ancestor, facing certain defeat, turned to forbidden rites. He prayed not to God, but to darker powers, forces that demanded a sacrifice in exchange for victory. When dawn came, his army stood triumphant. But his youngest child was gone, vanished from the records, erased by his own hand. That day marked both his coronation and his damnation. Other stories speak of a queen, desperate to conceive an heir. She sought remedies from alchemists, midwives, and mystics, but when none succeeded, she was said to have consumed potions laced with blood. Her child was born strong, but the queen's appetite never faded. What began as medicine twisted into ritual, and from her womb the curse was passed down to every generation that followed. Whether through pact or practice, the pattern was unmistakable. The dynasty's children did not live long. Sons were buried before they could hold a sword. Daughters disappeared before they could be wed. Official chronicles blamed illness, accident, even divine will. But the whispers in taverns and monasteries told another tale, that the dynasty's heirs were being devoured, sacrificed, consumed by the very family that birthed them. One monk, writing in secret, described the curse in haunting detail. They do not birth children, they birth offerings. Each child is born beneath a shadow, and each shadow is fed before it fades. His manuscript, hidden for centuries, survived only because it was buried beneath the stone floor of his abbey. The monk himself was never seen again. The symbols of the curse appeared everywhere. At royal baptisms, witnesses claimed the water in the font turned red. At coronations, torches blew out as if smothered by unseen hands. At funerals, ravens circled above, refusing to leave until the last shovel of dirt was laid. Superstitious peasants believed these signs were omens of divine wrath. The dynasty, of course, dismissed them as coincidence. Yet even they could not deny the relentless rhythm of loss that stalked their bloodline. But here lies the true horror. The curse was not spoken of only in rumor. There were moments, fleeting, dangerous moments, when the dynasty seemed to embrace it. Festivals were held in which mock sacrifices entertained the court. Masks were staged where actors in royal garb consumed effigies of infants, laughing as the crowd looked on in unease. Were these merely plays, symbolic rituals of power? Or were they grim echoes of something very real? Foreign envoys reported disturbing ceremonies held in locked halls, where only the highest members of the bloodline were permitted to enter. The doors were sealed with wax. Music played to drown out the sounds within. And when the doors opened again, the air reeked of iron and smoke. No outsider ever saw what happened inside, but the expressions of those who emerged, hollow, pale, trembling, spoke volumes. The curse was not merely a family burden. It became a weapon. Rivals used it to sow doubt in the dynasty's rule, spreading pamphlets and sermons that painted them as child-devouring monsters. The church grew uneasy, its silence bought with gold, its priests bound by fear. And yet, for all the horror, the dynasty endured. Year after year, generation after generation, they held their thrones, as though the curse that devoured their children also fed their power. How could such a paradox exist? Some historians argue that the curse was nothing more than a metaphor, a way for their enemies to frame them as inhuman, to stain their legacy with fear. Others insist that there was truth in every whisper, that the family truly partook in rites too terrible to comprehend. But whether fact or fable, the belief in the curse shaped their destiny. For when a people believe their rulers are damned, the rulers themselves begin to believe it too. By the middle of their reign, the dynasty no longer ran from the shadow. They wore it like armor. Their crests began to depict beasts devouring prey. Their ceremonies incorporated darker symbols, skulls, ravens, serpents entwined in crowns. It was as if they had ceased to fight the curse and instead embraced it, transforming it into an identity, a myth that bound their subjects in awe and fear alike. And yet, behind the grandeur, behind the calculated imagery, the reality remained the same. Children continued to vanish. Heirs continued to die. A family tree meant to stretch into eternity instead twisted into knots, branches cut short, names erased. Every new ruler rose to power carrying not just a crown, but the weight of expectation, that they too would be consumed, and that their children would not escape the fate written in blood. This was the heart of the curse. It was not a single act, nor a single tragedy. It was a cycle, a rhythm of horror that echoed through centuries, devouring innocence and silencing generations. And as it repeated again and again, it blurred the line between legend and truth. For the dynasty cursed to devour its own children did not simply rule a kingdom. They ruled a nightmare, one passed from cradle to coffin, from feast to funeral, from parent to child. A nightmare that could never be undone, because it was etched into the very blood that gave them life. And if the curse was written in blood, then blood was the only ink with which it could ever be told. To the world beyond the castle gates, the dynasty glittered with magnificence. Their banquets dazzled with silver goblets and golden plates, their gardens bloomed with exotic flowers brought from distant lands, and their processions paraded through streets lined with cheering subjects. But splendor is often a mask. Behind the velvet curtains, beyond the polished marble corridors, the true nature of the dynasty festered. And what unfolded within those palace walls was far darker than any enemy could have imagined. The palace itself was a fortress of secrets. High stone walls loomed over the city, casting shadows long after the sun had set. Its windows were narrow, its doors heavy, as though the very architecture was designed not only to keep enemies out, but to keep horrors in. Servants who walked those halls spoke of strange drafts that carried whispers where no one stood, of locked chambers that no key was ever seen to open, and of corridors where the light of candles seemed to die before touching the walls. It was within these halls that the dynasty's appetite revealed itself. Kitchens were commanded to prepare lavish feasts at odd hours of the night. Orders came with terrifying precision, meat served fresh, crimson juices still running. Servants, bound by fear, never dared to question the source. One cook, whose journal survived in secret, wrote of nights when the meat bore a disturbing familiarity, limbs too small, bones too delicate. He vanished shortly after his final entry. But the kitchens were only one part of the horror. Within the royal nurseries, the cries of infants were often silenced too soon. Nurses rotated in and out, none serving long before disappearing without explanation. Some claimed the walls of those rooms were cursed, that no child could survive long within them. Others whispered that the walls were not cursed at all, but rather watched over by eyes far too eager for the cries to end. The court itself, those lords and ladies who lived in the dynasty's orbit, understood the rules. They smiled when the rulers entered. They applauded at every feast, no matter how grotesque. They accepted gifts of jewelry and land, their silence purchased at a price too rich to refuse. For in this palace, loyalty was measured not in words, but in silence. To question what one saw was to sign one's own death warrant. And so they played their part in the charade. Dancers in a masquerade where the mask was survival itself. Diplomats who visited the court wrote careful letters back to their monarchs. They praised the dynasty's grandeur, but between the lines, their unease bled through. The air within these halls is thick, wrote one envoy. There is celebration, yet no joy. Splendor, yet no warmth. The children are never seen, and when one asks after them, the subject is quickly changed. His words, discreetly coded, suggest that even outsiders could sense the presence of something unspeakable behind the facade. And then there were the midnight gatherings. Accounts are fragmentary, whispered in rumor and half-erased in chronicles, but enough survives to paint a disturbing picture. On certain nights, the highest members of the dynasty convened in chambers sealed with wax and guarded by loyal men who swore oaths never to speak. Within, the air would fill with chanting, low and rhythmic, accompanied by the dull thrum of drums. No outsider ever saw the rituals, but those who stood guard swore that cries, short, sharp, unmistakably human, echoed through the doors. When the ceremonies ended, the rulers emerged pale, trembling, but with a fire in their eyes, as though whatever had occurred within had renewed their strength. Some historians argue these were no more than exaggerated tales of private banquets, but others insist they were rituals, acts of sacrifice that fed not only the dynasty's bodies, but its sense of invincibility. After each gathering, the rulers seemed emboldened, their reign more ruthless, their grip on power more unyielding. If it was madness with purpose. The servants, those closest to the horror, carried the heaviest burden. Many left the palace broken, their minds fractured by what they had witnessed. A few confided in priests, leaving behind confessions that survive to this day. One described seeing a child led into the chamber of the king, never to return. Another swore she delivered trays of meat that she knew, deep in her soul, had once been human. Their testimonies were dismissed as madness at the time, but in hindsight, they form a mosaic of truth too consistent to ignore. The fear inside the palace was not limited to the servants. Even the dynasty's own members lived in dread. Imagine being a child born into such a family, your cradle a prison, your lullabies sung in trembling voices, your every step shadowed by the possibility that you were not heir, but prey. The curse was not an abstract tale to them. It was a reality, one they could feel in the watchful eyes of their parents, in the silence that fell whenever their names were spoken. This is the paradox of the dynasty. Their grandeur dazzled the world, yet behind their walls, they became monsters to their own blood. Power had twisted into hunger. Authority had curdled into terror. The palace, a symbol of their might, had become a labyrinth of dread, where every corridor hid a secret, and every door might open onto a nightmare. And yet, despite everything, the dynasty endured. Servants stayed silent. Courtiers bowed deeper. Diplomats looked away. Because to speak of what one saw was to invite annihilation, not just upon oneself, but upon one's family, one's village, even one's kingdom. Fear was the dynasty's greatest weapon. It kept the palace walls intact, not with stone, but with silence. But silence cannot erase truth forever. Behind those palace walls, the curse was no longer just rumor, it was ritual. It had become the very heartbeat of the dynasty. And with each generation, the hunger grew stronger, bolder, harder to conceal. For if the palace was a fortress, then it was also a prison, one that trapped not only its servants and its heirs, but the dynasty itself. And as the curse deepened, one question became inevitable. How long before the hunger within those walls spilled beyond them, consuming not just children, but entire kingdoms? In every dynasty, the future is measured not by gold or armies, but by children. They are the promise of tomorrow, the vessels of legacy, the living assurance that power will endure beyond the grave. But for this cursed bloodline, children were not heirs. They were victims. Their births brought not celebration, but dread. Their cries in the night were not songs of life, but echoes of a death already foretold. From the moment of birth, the dynasty's children were surrounded not by joy, but by shadows. Chronicles describe royal nurseries filled with luxury, golden cradles, embroidered blankets, lullabies sung by the finest musicians. Yet within those same chambers, a coldness lingered. Servants whispered that no child ever laughed long, that the walls seemed to absorb their voices, swallowing joy and amplifying fear. Nurses rotated constantly, many refusing to stay after witnessing strange rituals conducted over the cradles. The fate of these children followed a cruel rhythm. Some died in infancy, their deaths explained away by sickness. But the frequency was too great, the excuses too rehearsed. Others lived long enough to toddle through palace halls, their innocence a fragile light in the darkness. And then, suddenly, they would vanish. Records of their lives cut short, names struck from chronicles, portraits destroyed, as if erasing them from memory could erase the truth of their fate. One of the most haunting accounts comes from a letter smuggled out by a governess. She described a boy, no older than 5, with bright eyes and a laugh that filled the nursery. He was the pride of the court, paraded before ambassadors as proof of the dynasty's strength. But one winter night, the boy disappeared. The next morning, a feast was held in the great hall. Platters of meat were served, richer and redder than usual. The boy's name was never spoken again. The governess fled the palace, her letter discovered only years later, stained with tears and fear. And he was not alone. A young princess, beloved by her ladies-in-waiting, was said to have been taken from her bed under the cover of night. Her chambermaids recalled the sound of muffled cries, followed by silence so absolute it chilled their bones. Days later, her chamber was sealed, her belongings burned. When the people asked of her fate, the dynasty declared she had been sent to a convent. But no convent ever claimed her. The dynasty had perfected the art of erasure. Whole branches of the family tree ended abruptly, with no explanation beyond vague words of illness, accident, or divine will. Yet the pattern was undeniable. Generations of heirs, swallowed by the curse, their blood consumed not by time, but by their own family. The most tragic element of all was the awareness these children seemed to possess. Some were said to resist their fate, clinging to servants, crying when summoned by their parents. Others, too young to understand, simply trusted, walking willingly into the very arms of their doom. Imagine the horror of a child reaching for their mother, only to be met not with comfort, but with hunger. The line between parent and predator blurred, leaving behind wounds too deep for history to fully comprehend. Servants who survived long enough to speak told stories of lullabies sung in trembling voices, of cradles rocked not with love, but with dread, of guards who turned their eyes away when children were led down certain corridors, knowing they would never return. These testimonies, scattered and half erased, paint a portrait of innocence betrayed on a scale too terrible to ignore. The dynasty, of course, cloaked their crimes in ritual. To them, the children's deaths were not accidents, but offerings. Sacrifices made to maintain power, to preserve the dynasty against the tide of history. In their twisted logic, the heirs were never meant to rule. They were meant to be consumed, to feed the very bloodline they were born into. It was a cycle of horror, dressed in ceremony, disguised as destiny. The tragedy extended beyond the palace walls. The people, though bound by loyalty and fear, could sense the absence. They saw heirs paraded through streets one year, only to vanish the next. They noticed how royal births were celebrated with extravagant feasts, but funerals for children were rare, often hushed or hidden altogether. Whispers spread in taverns and marketplaces, "The dynasty eats its own." Mothers clutched their children tighter, praying that fate had spared them from such a bloodline. And yet, the people did nothing. Fear silenced them, as it had silenced the servants and courtiers. To accuse the dynasty was to invite annihilation. And so, the children's fates remained unchallenged, their cries swallowed by walls too thick, their stories buried beneath centuries of silence. But silence cannot erase sorrow. Even in their grandeur, the dynasty could not escape the ghostly presence of those they had consumed. Heirs appeared in dreams, haunting their parents with eyes wide and accusing. Servants swore they heard the cries of children echoing through empty halls long after their deaths. Priests reported visions of blood-stained crowns, of infants placed upon altars. The dynasty dismissed these as superstition, but deep down, even they could not deny that the ghosts of their children lingered. And so, generation after generation, the curse repeated. Birth, dread, disappearance. Lullabies replaced by screams. Cradles by coffins. Portraits painted, then burned. Until the dynasty's legacy was no longer defined by glory, but by grief. The fate of their children was more than tragedy. It was prophecy fulfilled. For the curse had warned that no heir would live to inherit the throne, that the bloodline would devour itself from within. And with each child lost, the prophecy drew closer to completion. The palace may have silenced their names. The chronicles may have erased their faces. But the truth of their fate cannot be buried. The children of the cursed bloodline were not heirs to a throne. They were offerings to a hunger that no crown could contain. Every dynasty cloaks its sins in symbols. Some call them rituals, others call them madness. But in the palace of this cursed bloodline, the line between the two vanished entirely. What outsiders saw as cruelty, the dynasty insisted was ceremony. What looked like murder, they proclaimed as sacrifice. And yet, Beneath the golden masks of ritual, there was only hunger and the madness it birthed. The origins of these rites remain uncertain, but fragments of court records and forbidden manuscripts suggest a blend of superstition and desperation. It is said that when the first monarch of the bloodline faced the curse, a priest advised them that consuming the blood of their own offspring would preserve their power, ward off sickness, and bind their reign to the divine. Whether the priest believed this or merely whispered poison to a desperate ruler, no one knows. But the seed was planted, and once planted, it grew into ritual, an inheritance as binding as the throne itself. The ceremonies were not conducted in public view. They unfolded in the hidden chambers of the palace, under candlelight and silence. Priests dressed in crimson robes would prepare the chamber, drawing circles on the floor with ash, chanting verses said to be older than the kingdom itself. The monarch would enter, draped in black, followed by the child. There was no procession of joy, no celebration of life, only the quiet dread of inevitability. Witnesses, few though they were, describe scenes that blur the line between devotion and insanity. Children placed upon stone altars, garlands of withered flowers around their necks. Incense thick in the air, masking the metallic scent of blood. The monarch, eyes glazed with something between grief and madness, raising a ceremonial blade. And in that moment, a choice, parent or predator. Time and again, the blade fell. Time and again, ritual triumphed over love. The court justified these acts as sacred necessity. To them, it was not death, but transformation. They claimed the children's souls were purified, their essence absorbed by the dynasty, ensuring the throne's survival against enemies both mortal and supernatural. To the devout, it was sacrifice. To the skeptical, madness given structure. But whether sacred or insane, the result was always the same. Silence where once there had been laughter. Madness, after all, rarely announces itself with wild screaming or chaos. It wears the mask of reason. In this dynasty, madness wore the mask of ritual. Rulers convinced themselves they were chosen, not cursed. That their acts of cruelty were ordained, not condemned. That their own blood, spilled, consumed, erased, was a gift to the gods. And yet, behind their rituals, one can almost hear the echo of their guilt. There were moments when the illusion cracked. Chronicles mention kings and queens who hesitated, who wept as the blade trembled in their hands. Some screamed at the priests, begging for another way. Others locked themselves away, refusing to perform the ritual, only to be struck by sudden illness or death, which the court declared divine punishment. Whether coincidence or conspiracy, these deaths reinforced the belief. To refuse the ritual was to invite annihilation. Thus, madness became law. The most chilling detail lies in the way these rituals were hidden behind layers of performance. Painted murals in the palace once showed mothers holding infants in their arms, framed by halos of fire and light. To the unknowing, they seemed like images of love. But closer inspection revealed darker truths. The infant's eyes closed not in peace, but in death. The halos of fire were not blessings, but pyres. Even art became complicit in disguising horror as holiness. Whispers of rebellion did surface from time to time. Servants, horrified by what they had seen, begged priests to stop the rites. Some were silenced permanently. Others fled into exile, where their testimonies survive in scattered manuscripts. They speak of rulers who, after the ritual, walked through the palace halls in dazes, their hands trembling, their lips stained. These were not images of divine kings and queens, but of broken humans consumed by the very rituals they upheld. And so the question remains, were these rulers victims of madness or willing participants in sacred slaughter? Historians argue both sides. Some claim the dynasty was trapped by superstition, powerless to escape. Others believe they embraced the rituals as a means of control, finding in them a justification for cruelty. Perhaps both are true. Perhaps in the palace halls, ritual was the mask and madness the face beneath it. What cannot be denied is the effect it left behind. The rituals warped the dynasty beyond recognition, binding their identity not to governance, but to sacrifice. They became less rulers of a kingdom and more priests of a cult, worshipping themselves at the altar of blood. Madness was no longer the shadow. They had made it their crown. And when the people outside whispered of the dynasty eating its children, they were not simply describing horror. They were describing a ritualized madness so complete that it had become indistinguishable from faith. In the end, whether ritual or madness, the outcome was the same. Children vanished, legacies shattered, and a dynasty cursed to devour itself from within. And as each generation performed the rite anew, the question of whether they were holy or insane mattered less and less. For history does not remember intentions, it remembers blood. Power is never silent. Even in the most gilded courts, behind every jeweled crown and polished smile, there are whispers, soft enough to avoid the throne's wrath, but loud enough to shape its destiny. And in the cursed dynasty's court, those whispers were sharper than daggers. They carried secrets, suspicions, and fears, echoing through corridors lined with portraits of rulers who had already devoured their own heirs. The palace itself was an echo chamber of paranoia. Courtiers moved with rehearsed elegance by day, their laughter practiced, their words chosen carefully. But when night fell and shadows stretched across marble floors, a different language emerged. Servants spoke in hushed tones, guards exchanged nervous glances, and advisors whispered warnings cloaked as flattery. Everyone knew something was wrong, yet no one dared to name it aloud. To speak the truth too clearly was to invite a fate as grim as the children's. Still, truth has a way of seeping through cracks. Chronicles tell us of hushed conversations between ladies-in-waiting who washed blood from silk robes, of cooks who noticed the sudden absence of meals prepared for the young princes, of guards who counted fewer footsteps in the nursery each passing year. Their whispers were fragments, but together they formed a chilling picture. The dynasty was consuming itself, and everyone within the court was forced to watch. Fear, however, did not silence ambition. Some courtiers saw the curse not as tragedy, but as opportunity. If heirs continued to vanish, the line of succession would weaken. Cousins, uncles, even distant relatives maneuvered for advantage, whispering not just of horror, but of power. Alliances were formed in secret chambers, hands shaken under candlelight, while all the while, the curse hung above them like a guillotine. The whispers became not only about what had happened, but about what might yet be gained. Not all whispers were political. Some carried sorrow. Servants who had rocked the cradles of doomed children wept quietly, hiding their grief in silence. Priests, sworn to uphold the rituals, confided doubts to one another in the cloisters, fearing that their faith had been twisted beyond recognition. Even the musicians, whose duty was to fill the palace with beauty, began to lace their songs with mournful undertones, disguising grief as art. In every corner of the court, whispers grew, each one a fragile attempt to keep humanity alive in a palace consumed by madness. But whispers can also be dangerous. They travel faster than truth, feeding paranoia and suspicion. In one recorded instance, a servant claimed to hear that the queen herself had cursed her children, striking a bargain with unseen forces. Within weeks, the servant vanished. No trial, no farewell, just silence, as though he had never existed. Another whisper claimed a rebellious faction within the court sought to rescue the children before their fate could be sealed. Whether such a plot truly existed or was invented to justify purges, no one can say. What is certain is that dozens of courtiers disappeared in the aftermath, their names erased from records as thoroughly as the children's. Fear bred silence, but silence bred more fear. The court became a theater of masks, smiles painted over dread, loyalty performed in exchange for survival. Each courtier learned to whisper only to those they trusted absolutely, and even then, trust was fragile. Who was listening? Who was reporting back to the throne? A misplaced word, a moment of hesitation, even a sigh at the wrong time could seal one's fate. And yet, in those hushed voices, the truth endured. They whispered of nurseries gone dark, of feasts too lavish, of rituals conducted in locked chambers. They whispered of a dynasty that claimed divine right while drowning in blood. For all the power of the crown, it could not silence what people felt in their bones. The palace was haunted, not by ghosts alone, but by the living memory of children betrayed. The whispers did not stop at the palace gates. They trickled into the streets, carried by dismissed servants, wandering musicians, and disillusioned priests. In taverns, rumors spread like wildfire. The royals eat their young. Some dismissed it as tavern gossip, drunken tales told for shock. But others listened, believed, and feared. Parents began to keep their children closer, merchants refused to linger near the palace at night, and prayers were whispered not for the dynasty's prosperity, but for its end. And therein lay the danger. For whispers, though fragile, have the power to topple empires. A single rumor can poison loyalty, erode faith, and sow rebellion. The dynasty's greatest threat was not armies beyond its borders, but murmurs within its own halls. Murmurs that painted kings and queens not as divine rulers, but as monsters in gilded crowns. To the rulers, whispers were a plague to be eradicated. Edicts were issued, declaring slander against the throne a crime punishable by death. Spies were unleashed, listening at doors, trailing conversations, reporting every hint of doubt. Entire families vanished for words spoken too softly, for secrets shared too recklessly. Yet no matter how many voices they silenced, the whispers returned, because they were born not of malice, but of truth. In the end, the court itself became a paradox, a place of splendor built on silence, of power undermined by fear, of loyalty hollowed out by whispered dissent. The dynasty sat upon its throne, blind to the fact that the very walls of its palace carried the sound of its undoing. And so, while children vanished into rituals, while rulers justified their madness with ceremony, the whispers continued, slipping under doors, clinging to tapestries, echoing in empty chambers. They were the breath of those who dared not scream, the memory of those erased, the prophecy of collapse yet to come. For in every empire cursed by its own blood, whispers are not merely secrets. They are warnings. And when rulers refuse to listen, whispers become history's voice, telling the story that kings and queens tried so desperately to silence. Fear is the longest shadow. Long after kings and queens are buried, long after palaces fall into ruin, it is fear that lingers, etched into memory, whispered through generations. For the cursed bloodline, fear was their truest heir, the only legacy that survived when thrones crumbled and crowns were buried beneath dust. The dynasty had built its empire on rituals, secrecy, and silence. But when empires rot from within, they do not collapse quietly. The fear that once silenced voices began to seep outward, staining every corner of the realm. Farmers in distant villages told stories of children who disappeared at night, even if they had never set foot inside the palace. Mothers warned their children never to stray near the royal processions, whispering that a glance from the monarch could mark them for death. Even merchants traveling the road swore they felt an unseen gaze upon them whenever the palace's shadow came into view. This fear was not abstract, it had weight. It shaped how people lived, how they prayed, how they taught their children. Whole generations grew up believing their rulers were not human, but creatures bound to hunger and shadows. Loyalty was no longer devotion, it was survival. To love the dynasty was dangerous, but to defy them was worse. And so, fear became the invisible law of the land. The dynasty themselves were prisoners of that same legacy. Every new monarch inherited not just the throne, but the weight of whispered curses. Their every act was measured against the past. Would they continue the rituals, or would they defy them? Some tried to break free, declaring reforms, promising protection for heirs, seeking to restore faith in the crown. Yet one by one, those rulers met untimely ends, sickness, accidents, assassinations disguised as divine punishment. Whether killed by fate or by those who wished to preserve the old order, the message was clear. The curse was stronger than any crown. And so, the cycle continued. Monarch after monarch bowed to fear, performing the rituals, silencing dissent, erasing heirs from memory. Fear had become their crown jewel, more enduring than gold, more powerful than armies. It defined them, even as it consumed them. Outside the palace, the legacy grew darker still. Fear transformed into folklore, into stories told by firelight. Parents frightened disobedient children with tales of a queen who prowled nurseries at night, searching for little ones to devour. Wanderers spoke of cursed forests near the capital, where the cries of lost children echoed among the trees. Ballads sung by traveling musicians carried hidden warnings, their verses speaking of kings who drank the blood of their heirs. Even when softened into legend, the truth remained intact. The dynasty had feasted on its future. Fear does not simply linger, it mutates. Centuries later, when the dynasty's rule had ended, when the palace itself was abandoned to ivy and dust, people still avoided its ruins. Travelers reported strange sounds at night, the laughter of children, the echo of lullabies, the weeping of mothers. Some swore the air grew colder near the palace walls, as though the very stones retained the memory of screams. Historians dismissed these tales as superstition, but the common folk knew better. They understood that fear, once birthed, never truly dies. The dynasty's enemies, too, used fear as a weapon. Rival kingdoms spread the stories deliberately, amplifying the whispers until they became undeniable. To them, the cursed bloodline was not merely a dynasty. It was a warning to all who sought to defy morality in the pursuit of power. Pamphlets, sermons, and later chronicles painted the rulers as beasts wearing crowns, proof that sin brings downfall, that no throne built on blood can last. The dynasty's greatest achievement had become its greatest curse. It was remembered not for victories, but for its own horrors. And what of the people who lived under their rule? They bore the deepest scars. For them, fear was not just memory, it was inheritance. Children raised on warnings grew into parents who repeated them, embedding dread into the rhythm of daily life. Even after the dynasty's fall, villages refused to send their children into service at royal courts, fearing the curse would awaken in another bloodline. Families clung to their own, unwilling to trust rulers who claimed benevolence, for they had learned the bitter truth: power devours, and it always begins with the innocent. What makes fear so enduring is its invisibility. Unlike palaces, it cannot be toppled. Unlike rulers, it cannot be executed. Unlike wealth, it cannot be stolen. Fear embeds itself in memory, passed from one generation to the next, until it becomes indistinguishable from history itself. And that was the dynasty's final legacy. Long after their names faded, their terror lived on. Even today, the ruins of their palace stand as a monument not to power, but to dread. Tourists and scholars approach its gates with curiosity, yet many refuse to enter after dusk. Locals claim that the walls still whisper, that shadows move without light, that children's laughter can be heard when the wind shifts. Some say the ghosts of the lost heirs wander the halls, searching for voices to hear their story, desperate not to be forgotten. Others believe the rulers themselves remain, trapped in the rituals they could never escape, condemned to hunger for eternity. Whether one believes in curses or not, one truth remains: fear outlived the dynasty. It became their crown, their heir, their inheritance to the world. And in that, the prophecy was fulfilled, not through conquest, not through legacy, but through dread. For what is a dynasty, if not the memory it leaves behind? And what greater curse than to be remembered not for glory, but for horror? Theirs was a throne built on fear. And fear is the only thing history refused to bury. Every story ends, but curses rarely do. The dynasty that devoured its own children may have collapsed beneath the weight of its sins, yet its shadow stretches far beyond its ruined palace. What remains is not the memory of wealth or conquest, but the reminder of what happens when power consumes the very blood it was meant to protect. History often flatters rulers. It records their victories in battle, their alliances, their monuments of stone. But with this bloodline, history remembers something else: a hunger disguised as ritual, a madness presented as destiny, a throne purchased not with loyalty, but with the flesh of its own heirs. That is the lesson of the curse, not merely that it destroyed a dynasty, but that it exposed the terrible fragility of human power. The prophecy that no heir would inherit the throne was not only fulfilled, it became inevitable. For how could a future exist when the very seeds of tomorrow were sacrificed to preserve today? In devouring their children, the dynasty consumed not just flesh, but possibility. They destroyed their own tomorrow, ensuring their line would end not with conquest, but with silence. And that silence is louder than any victory could have been. What can we learn from such horror? At its heart, the story of the cursed bloodline is not only about superstition or madness. It is about the dangers of fear, the lengths to which humans will go to preserve power, and the cost of denying innocence. The dynasty believed that blood could sustain them, that sacrifice would grant them eternity. But eternity is not built on fear. Fear corrodes until nothing is left but ruins and whispers. The tragedy of the children is the tragedy of the dynasty itself. Innocence betrayed, trust shattered, futures erased. Their voices were silenced in life, but history ensures they are not silenced in death. Every whisper, every rumor, every legend that survived is a testament to them, a refusal to let their memory vanish, no matter how hard the dynasty tried to erase it. In the end, it was not the rulers who were immortalized, but the children they sought to destroy. And what of us, listening centuries later? Why do such stories grip us still? Perhaps because they reflect a truth we fear to face, that power unchecked is always dangerous, that ambition without restraint devours its own. The dynasty's fate warns us that cruelty, even when wrapped in ritual, corrodes not only those who suffer, but those who wield it. They sought to escape their curse, yet in clinging to it, they ensured it would outlive them. Even now, their legacy survives, not in monuments, but in cautionary tales. Parents whisper to their children not to wander too far at night. Historians debate whether the stories were exaggeration or truth. Tourists step carefully through the ruins, feeling the weight of something unseen pressing against their skin. The dynasty may be gone, but the lesson of their curse is eternal. Power that destroys its own foundation cannot stand. In the end, their fate was sealed not by prophecy, but by choice. Each ruler had the chance to break the cycle, to defy the rituals, to protect their heirs. Some tried and died for it. Others surrendered willingly, bowing to fear rather than resisting it. The curse was not in their blood, it was in their belief. And belief, once poisoned, is the deadliest curse of all. So, the story closes where it began, with whispers. Whispers of children lost, of rulers undone, of a dynasty devouring itself. Whispers that became history, history that became legend, legend that became warning. The palace may be silent now, but the silence speaks louder than any words. It speaks of hunger, of madness, of fear, and of the eternal truth that no throne, no matter how gilded, can survive when it feasts upon its own future. That is the legacy of the cursed bloodline. Not glory, not empire, not triumph, but a single, unshakable lesson. Power that turns against its own will always, inevitably, collapse. Curses belong to the past, or so we like to believe. We imagine them as relics of forgotten dynasties, confined to ruined palaces and dusty chronicles. But what if the curse of this bloodline is not just history? What if its shadow stretches further, into the way we still understand power, legacy, and fear today? Strip away the rituals, the altars, the secrecy, and what remains is a story of rulers sacrificing their own future for the illusion of control. Is that not a pattern we still see? Leaders clinging to authority at any cost, consuming the very people they were meant to protect. Parents choosing power over their children's innocence. Institutions feeding on those they should safeguard. The dynasty's horror is extreme, but its reflection is uncomfortably familiar. Modern history offers countless echoes. Dictators who sacrifice generations of youth in wars to preserve their thrones. Corporations that devour the dreams of the young to maintain profit. Families so obsessed with legacy and wealth that they destroy the very heirs they claim to protect. These are not altars of stone, but they are altars nonetheless, and the sacrifices made upon them are just as real. The curse of consuming the future to preserve the present is not confined to myth. It is alive, reshaped, modernized. Consider how fear still functions as the truest currency of power. The dynasty ruled through dread, silencing dissent, erasing heirs, and cloaking atrocity in ritual. Today, fear remains the strongest weapon. Governments justify surveillance and oppression in the name of protection. Leaders cultivate fear of outsiders, fear of change, fear of collapse, anything to maintain their grip. The methods differ, but the principle remains unchanged. Power feeds on fear, and fear is the easiest inheritance to pass down. Even in families untouched by crowns, the story resonates. How many dynasties of wealth and influence fracture under the weight of greed? how many heirs vanish, not into altars, but into scandal, addiction, or estrangement, because the pursuit of legacy devours love. The cursed bloodline becomes less a story of monsters and more a mirror held up to human ambition. In every age, in every society, some choose power over their children. Some choose legacy over life. And in that choice, they repeat the curse. The modern world even ensures these stories live on differently. Where whispers once traveled in palace halls and village taverns, today they spread across networks, social media, headlines. Secrets no longer stay buried. The same way villagers once whispered, "The royals eat their young," we now whisper, or tweet, that leaders devour their people. Technology has changed the stage, but not the performance. Whispers remain eternal, shaping how we see those in power. So what is the lesson for us? That curses are never simply supernatural. They are choices repeated until they feel inevitable. The dynasty believed they had no escape. That prophecy bound them to bloodshed. But in truth, it was their fear of breaking tradition, their obsession with control, their refusal to protect their heirs that doomed them. In the same way, modern powers insist that sacrifice is necessary, that suffering is the price of stability. And yet, the more they cling, the faster they collapse. The cursed bloodline teaches us something chilling. The greatest danger is not an external enemy, but the hunger within. When power devours its own foundation, its heirs, its people, its future, it guarantees its own destruction. History, whether ancient or modern, repeats this truth endlessly. Thrones fall, empires crumble, corporations collapse, families fracture. Not because of curses carved in stone, but because of choices carved into human ambition. So when we look back at the dynasty's ruined palace, when we hear the whispers of children in its empty halls, we are not just gazing into the past. We are looking into a mirror. We are seeing how fear, hunger, and power consume what they should protect. And if we do not learn, if we repeat the same choices, then perhaps the curse was never broken. Perhaps it was only passed on. In the end, the legacy of that cursed bloodline is not confined to history books or legends. It lives wherever power feeds on innocence, wherever rulers sacrifice the future to preserve their present, wherever fear is mistaken for loyalty. The question is not whether the curse was real. The question is whether we still live under it.